concurring with you. Just very general question in terms of the democratic process. What were you saying about we elect people and some of them don't even know the process, and you used a general line about democracy?
Well, democracy presumes an enlightened electorate, and unfortunately, that's not always the case, which is why, in many instances, things don't work as they were envisioned. And of course, in that circumstance, people begin to get more and more apathetic with the process because the people that are elected don't seem to be doing the job that they think they ought to be doing. So it's sort of a continuous situation that in many instances just gets us deeper and deeper in the depths of governmental incompetence. What I was saying is, a lot of times, particularly in Chicago, we elect people that have been very active in grassroots organizations and so forth. And the old saying that the revolutionaries can't run the government is sometimes very true. Che Guevara realized that. He said, no, I can't. I don't want to run the government. I'm going to go on to bigger and better things, and left Castro there to do whatever he was doing. But I'm just saying that we do have people, because, as you well know, Chicago is a community of neighborhoods and so forth, and the people who are elected to the city council, for instance, is a good example, are people in many instances that rather than having any sort of specific training, they are grassroots individuals. Now that's fine as long as they also expand their knowledge to understand what the true job of a city councilman really is. The basic job of a city councilman, which a lot of people in Chicago don't realize, is that as a legislator, not as what some people describe themselves. We had an alderman who just retired who described himself as the alley alderman. In other words, he would be there supplying garbage cans and getting the alleys fixed and so forth. But as far as legislation, I think the whole time I was there for the 16 years, I don't think he ever introduced an ordinance. But of course, his constituents didn't care about that because they were looking at him to do exactly that. Now that's okay, except then that gives the executive branch freer reign to do whatever it wants to do. In other words, the mayor, without there being checks and balances on the part of the legislative branch, which is the city council.
Why do people?
Okay, I'm getting worse here.
I'll be right with you. Track going there for a while.
Oh, is that what it was? Yeah. Okay.
Well, we've been all over the neighborhoods asking people what they're looking for, and that's all they tell us about garbage and alleys and streets. Well, why do people expect that?
I think because primarily they have been over the years just given.
People expect.
Okay, so people.
Oh yeah. Oh, you want me to? Gotcha.
Expect, yeah.
Gotcha. I got you. Okay. Rather than okay. I think people in Chicago expect their legislators, particularly locally, the aldermen, if you will, to just get involved in things such as those that would be done by the gentleman who's heading streets and sanitation. In other words, we call the ward superintendent, who is the person who keeps the ward clean, and picks up the garbage and sweeps the streets. I think also the fact that there is so little involvement on the part of the electorate as to what the council is doing, they really don't have an idea as to what the responsibilities are. One thing that I think is very unfortunate, and I tried to do for a number of years, something that's very simple and is done in many cities, simply put in the newspaper when there's going to be a council meeting. That doesn't seem like much. They don't do it. Many cities, they list what the committee meeting's going to be, when it takes place, where, and what the agenda is, and people who are involved. It's very easy for them to know that they want to be there. In this city, however, it's just the opposite. People are sort of kept out. If they could operate in secrecy and hold the meetings at midnight, they'd be very happy to do that. And as a result, people don't even understand what the responsibilities of their elected officials in many instances really are, particularly that of aldermen.
Okay, you said that politics here was the politics of neighborhoods. Can you tell us that and then explain what you mean? We need a good, strong statement that this is the Chicago.
In Chicago, we have what I would say is the politics of neighborhoods, primarily because of the fact, don't forget, as we speak, this is still the case, that statistics and studies and analyses show that Chicago is the most residentially segregated city in the entire country and probably the universe. And although it's not as bad as it was, still, comparatively speaking, you can still, to some degree, determine the racial or sometimes ethnic background of an individual simply by his or her address. It used to be you could definitely tell it. Now there is some intermingling, but certainly not as much as there ought to be and that there are in most other places. So as a result, every little enclave has its own individualistic beliefs and philosophies as to what they feel is right or wrong, and they elect or select people. You don't find, for instance, a majority white area electing a black to represent them. And what even exacerbates that is we have 50 members of the city council. New York has 25. New York is twice the size of Chicago. So, of course, the smaller the political jurisdiction, the more parochial it gets. And as a result of that, we have everybody in their own little groups. And I can remember when the mayor died, which we're talking about, Richard I, Richard Daley, as compared to his son, who was called, in addition to other things, Richard II. There are other things that I think are even more an indication of what people really think about him. But at any rate, when he died, and I was in the council at the time, every ethnic group had their own little caucus. You know, the Polish alderman went one way, the Irish alderman went another, and there was one Armenian there. He didn't know what to do. So we, you know, but then there was a situation of trying to put it together. The black alderman had enough votes along with the Polish alderman to get an alderman, but that didn't work because although we had more votes than the Poles, they refused to allow us to name who it was going to be. So they said, well, yeah, but it's got to be a Pole. We said, no, we've got the most votes. It's got to be a black. It ended up, of course, being someone who was of Eastern European extraction and, of course, who eventually lost to an Irishman. But the fact is that I think in Chicago, more than most places I've seen, you do have that. Politically, it's always been when the party was going to slate, they had, you know, if you had 4 spots, one went to a Pole, one to a black, one to an Irishman. I mean, that was always the credo as to exactly who was going to be slated for office. And I think that's good in one way, but I think predominantly it's bad because it keeps divisiveness going, and it doesn't give the city or those who represent it a feeling of cohesiveness.
So,
I'm going to...
One of that? Oh, I'm sorry.
Steve, I'm hearing the noise of this getting hit.
Speeding.
okay. So, ethnic politics is still important in Chicago? I mean, a lot of people tell us that, you know, politics around here is almost tribal.
That's probably, politics in Chicago is tribal. There's no doubt about it. I think many people at this point have gotten to realize the fact, when we look at what's going on in what was Yugoslavia, many places where people are just doing terrible things to folks for one reason only. You're not one of us. And so I think seemingly there is a real focus on what I think is a very unfortunate human proclivity. That is to dislike those who are not in your particular group, and even worse, maybe to do something about it. So we have that here. What we do is, though, we try to disenfranchise those who are not in the group. And I think whoever described Chicago as being tribal in its political activity is probably pretty much correct. And it isn't getting any better. And ironically, although African Americans have done extremely well in the last 10 years, or even a little before that, the death of Harold Washington, who was revered and in fact used to eat regularly in this restaurant where we are right now, the loss of Harold Washington is not anywhere as great as the loss of the power that the African American community had. What we have now in Chicago is a growing Hispanic population, which would rather join with whites than to join with blacks. So now what we see, in my opinion, with the present mayor is a person who is trying to put together a coalition, who has put together a coalition of whites and Hispanics, and blacks are constantly losing. There are many more blacks that had jobs and positions of authority and prestige in previous administrations than there are in this one. And I think the interesting thing about Chicago now is there is no majority of anybody. Everybody is a minority. We are a city of minorities, but putting together the two the coalition now is the whites and the Hispanics, and what African Americans hopefully will do, and if they do this, they will still be the power that they ought to be, is just to collectively go out and do the same thing everybody else does. You know, everybody else joins with their own group. We have not done that to the extent that I think we will have to do if we are in fact going to continue to be a big influence in this city.
Why not?
The blacks in Chicago, for whatever reason, have not, as they have to a great degree in other municipalities, been able to stay together. And I can't really explain the reason why we would have, for instance, influential black members of the clergy out on television supporting the incumbent, who happens to be white, but that's not the issue, who in many of our feelings, mine included, is incompetent, when you had an African-American candidate who had been the Attorney General of the state of Illinois, who had been a state office holder for 16 years, and have all kinds of credentials and the ability to get things done. So you've got black ministers on TV endorsing the white incumbent. I'm saying even getting away from race, even though that is a factor, because it's my belief that probably most white clergymen also voted for Mayor Daley, but you didn't see any of them on TV making commercials saying, I'm from Master Daley. So I think that we do have, unfortunately, part of a plantation mentality here, and it's my opinion that many of these people who do that now wanted to do it when Mayor Washington was in office. They just couldn't afford to.
Well, what do they get out of the deal? I mean,
well, what some of these ministers may get out of the deal is something that's minute compared to what could be done if we really had a cohesive, united, unified effort. They may get a vacant lot next to the church for $1 or something of that sort. It's selling out your constituency or your community for nothing.
Is it also sort of like people have just given up in terms of, you know, Daley can't get beaten, so you get something out of the deal? You were telling me about tilting of windmills.
There is one businessman, start over. Okay. There is one businessman who ironically considers himself to be a real friend of Harold Washington, has written a number of books about him, who endorsed the mayor. A lot of people were very upset about this, because some people you expect to do it because their credibility is lower than whale feces anyway, so you know it doesn't matter. But in this instance, that was not the case. His comment was, I want to be with a winner. Well, still, that to me suggests that, you know, if somebody, notwithstanding what political liabilities they bring, if you think they're going to win, well, then you vote for them or you support them or endorse them. I don't think that's the case. I think in some instances people did, there was a quid pro quo, in other words. In some instances, for people of that statute, there was something that was offered and probably rendered that bought the endorsement, if you will, which of course is the way the system works. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. I'm just saying that these people didn't need to do that because they were beyond that station. They could have stuck with their philosophical concepts and backed someone who philosophically had the same type of political beliefs that they have had in the past.
Well, Hispanics, you know, you're talking about the white Hispanic coalition.
Mm-hmm.
Well, 10 years ago, Hispanics were, you know, a crucial part of Harold Washington's coalition. Why would they want to do what they're doing now? And start by saying Hispanics.
Right. The Hispanics in the Chicago political scene were first brought to real recognition during the Harold Washington administration. In fact, the council wars that many of you knew about even outside of the city of Chicago, and council wars just briefly was the fact that Harold Washington was the first mayor of African-American ancestry in Chicago. There were many other people who, of course, whites who did not want him there. Many of them were in the city council, and they had the majority of the council. So they were able to, in many instances, not stop, but certainly impede the mayor's programs. There was a lawsuit filed before Harold Washington relative to the remapping of the city ward boundaries, stating that the remapping that was done and passed by the city council under Jane Burns' administration was actually to diminish the voting power of or dilute the voting power of African Americans in the city. I was a party plaintiff in the lawsuit. We won that suit. It was won during Washington's administration, although when we filed the suit, obviously Harold Washington wasn't even thought of. Jane Byrne was in office. That required a number of special elections to the city council. We were able to win those special elections, therefore getting 25 members of the council against the mayor, 25 in favor, and of course the mayor, under those instances by statute, is a tiebreaker. It's the only time the mayor votes to break a tie. The person who was elected, that last 25th person, was Luis Gutierrez, who is of Puerto Rican ancestry, and all the mayor's people, whites, Hispanics, blacks, everybody went into that war to make sure that he was elected. That was the fight. When you talk about warfare, that was warfare. When Mayor Daley said he was going to run, the first person to defect from the Harold Washington coalition of blacks, Hispanics, and whites, because there were many progressive whites in that coalition too, was Luis Gutierrez.
So
he is now a congressman. They drew a district specifically for him, and I'm sure that's what the Daley forces had promised him. Daley has also given Hispanics many, many positions at the expense, not of whites, but of blacks. And the statistics will show that. The number of people in positions of authority, the number of people with jobs in the city of Chicago, and the other agencies that the mayor actually controls, such as the Board of Education. The superintendent of schools is a gentleman of Hispanic descent, used to be an African American. The superintendent of police used to be African American, it is now Hispanic. I could go on down the line. So that's it. Blacks are being put in a position of farther to the back of the bus, if you will, and Hispanics are moving up along with the white coalition.
And what else? You told me something else in terms of Hispanics and whites who they'd rather ally with.
There's been a study relative to how we can explain, well, not explain, but the facts. So I'm not a psychiatrist. I don't know why this happens. Pierre de Visay, who is an urbanologist and works for one of the universities here in Chicago and has come out over the years with very interesting statistics, states that Hispanics would rather ally themselves with whites than blacks. Now, you recall that even in the last two decennial census, they have been able to state that Hispanics have been able to determine whether they are white or black. That used to not be the case. You were just Hispanic. When in 1970 they started saying Hispanic but white or black, so they even make a distinction. Even more so, Professor de Visay's research showed that Hispanics don't want to deal with each other necessarily. By that I mean Mexicans would rather deal with whites than with Puerto Ricans. So you really, but still they'd rather deal with Puerto Ricans than with blacks. So you've got this pecking order, if you will, and as long as Daley is going to be able, this is what he's doing, he's playing the race. There's no other way to put it. You can call it whatever you want, it's smart politics, a coalition building, or whatever. But as long as he can maintain that coalition with enough Hispanics and some blacks who are referred to by certain statements in the black community that aren't very kind, but they are there and they pick up whatever crumbs are left, he can remain in office. Not only that, Mayor Daley, in addition to that, is probably more of a Republican philosophically than he is a Democrat, and because of that, he has a close alliance with the governor of the state of Illinois, who is a Republican, and there are certain things done in the General Assembly and the legislature that certainly are for the mayor. For instance, a lot of people don't even realize this. The next time we have a mayoral election in this city, it is not going to be partisan. It will be nonpartisan. The General Assembly passed this. Both houses are controlled by the Republicans. Obviously, the mayor wanted it. And next time he runs, then there will be a nonpartisan election where whoever wins 50% plus one of the vote will, of course, be elected. And, of course, if no one does, then there'll be a runoff between the top two vote getters.
Now, even with that new electoral system, what Daley the Second is doing, Daley the Younger, Daley Jr., in many ways is what almost every successful Chicago mayor has to do. and that's to build a winning coalition. Can you tell us about the importance of coalition building and just the, from Daley to Daley kind of continuity?
Coalition building is, of course, very important, but you can do it in a way that is not on a discriminatory manner. Daley the first, or the real Mayor Daley, as we say, having come from Bridgeport, having been a member of a gang of hoodlums that were involved in the race riot of 1919, the Hamburgs was the name of this group, I do not think he was the most liberal person around. However, notwithstanding that, he was a master politician at coalition building. And he, unlike the present mayor, his son, was able to do so in a situation where he had something for everyone. His was more ethnic than racial. I mean, he really would go to the Polish community with one thing, and the German community got this. Everybody got something. The Irish, his people, got more than anybody else, but of course everybody got something, including the blacks. In fact, the blacks were the ones who kept him in office for a long time. It was the Dawson machine, Dawson being the black congressman at the time, that put Mayor Daley where he was, which is why Bill Dawson was the vice chairman of the Democratic Party, Cook County Central Committee, and even after he passed away, Daley never put anybody in that position, just to show the reverence that he had for Bill Dawson. So you had all of these various groups that were together in a coalition, which certainly is a much more democratic way of handling a coalition than the present day when you are just practically easing out one group. As we speak, there is a charade going on in the federal district court, again on a remap. Again, we have a situation. This is the first time in the history of this city where the city council is majority minority. You have 24 whites and you have 26 African Americans and Hispanics collectively. If in fact things were going to be done in the proper way, you could have a whole different situation. But that's not the case because we have so many people who are tied into this coalition.
No, I'll do that later. So
Okay.
keep going. Thanks.
Okay.
This is great, by the way. Thank
Good.
you very
Is it
much.
working well? All right.
Yeah. As a matter of fact, I think you're reading my cue sheet over here.
Okay.
Oh, you're doing it with
How's your ride doing? Is it okay?
Yeah, it's not hurting. It's just tearing for whatever reason, which I don't think would look good on the camera.
Actually, you're not seeing it at all.
Oh no, it's not showing.
You
Okay.
look great on camera.
Good,
Very
thank you.
We were covering the campaigns. We went to a Dump Daley rally, not too far away from here. I think down over in the South 60s, the big church. And there was speaker after speaker, and I got to tell you, the rhetoric was pretty hot.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't on the level of Mayor Daley's incompetence.
Yeah, that's a given. It was probably
I guess first of all, how would you explain? I'm going to ask you a number of questions deconstructing this because there's a lot more going on than just people being against Daley. But first of all, how would you explain to a non-Chicago audience you got a mayor, who seems pretty popular and at least does campaign in the African American community? You go to a rally, and you seem to have a united black political leadership standing completely united against him, using very strong rhetoric about him. How would you first explain that?
okay. People who are not familiar with Chicago politics might see what they see on the TV news as a mayor who everybody likes. That is not the case at all. In fact, if you go to Dump Daley rallies or many other rallies during a campaign, you will see that the mayor is not well thought of by a lot of African American and progressive whites and some Hispanics. The way he gets away with it, however, is very interesting. I am a radio talk show host. I work on 2 radio stations, 2 different talk shows on both. I can't get him on a show. He will not come on. He did have one press secretary who told my producer, go to hell, we're not coming, He is very inarticulate. He did not debate. He refused to debate his opponents, although every other mayor has always done that. The press, which is totally in his pocket, believe it or not, editorializes as to reasons why he shouldn't debate, not the real reason, because he can't speak and he doesn't have any ideas, but they say, well, he's got a record and he doesn't have to. That's the most ridiculous thing. If it was somebody else, then of course that would not be the case. So it appears as though he's doing well. And, you know, one thing about the mayor that surprised me that I really didn't anticipate this being as bad as it is. I knew he would have to surround himself with people who at least had some semblance of competence. But I did not expect that advisory group to be so insular. They're all the same people. They're all white Irish men. That is the inner group. And of course, if all of you have the same experience in life and the same background, you all come up with the same answers. And it's unfortunate that there isn't somebody there to say, listen, you know, at least do this, do that, because there are some things that certainly ought to be done for the good of the city. But the primary thing is he's able to put forth this facade of there being sort of an overall acceptance of his administration based on the fact that he refuses to debate, he refuses to really get out there. Some shows he goes on, he won't accept phone calls. If anybody comes on my show and says we won't accept calls, I say, well, you don't want to talk to me. Go to the sales department.
Okay, so we're talking about a mayor who's very good at PR.
Right.
Okay, now going back to the rally, you know, I would guess in looking at this footage that people sound very, very bitter, very, very angry. Okay, is that bitterness part of the loss of political power and the fact that he can't be beaten the way it is right now? I mean, how would you explain the bitterness that you hear?
Let me just give you a
Sure.
little background here, and I think part of this is a racial perception.
Right.
I think a white audience looking at some of the things that were said at that Dump Daley rally, it bordered for them, I think, on demagoguery against Daley. For whatever reason, I'm not saying they don't have the
Right.
So
I
we
understand.
need you to, if you could help sort of put that in the context for
Yeah.
an audience.
Okay.
About
All
sort of
right.
the
I
styles,
got you.
why people talk like that, why they're so upset,
Yeah.
why they're in that position.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
And look at me as we're doing.
Right. I think that many people who feel that the mayor is doing a good job for the reasons that I mentioned, that he's got a good PR operation, look at people who are criticizing him, and maybe in some vitriolic manner that maybe in some instances on, in the opinion of someone who is not being subjected to it, may be an overstatement of the case, feel that it is an overstatement primarily because they feel that he's doing a good job based on the reason we previously mentioned. However, let me say this, that a lot of African Americans who live every day in areas that are underserved by city services, where a lot of these people who are looking at, well, why are they saying that, just accept these services as being there. When you look at what happens in the inner city relative to education, when you look at what's happening with health care, many of the things that are definitely the sole responsibility of the city administration, I'm not talking about something that the mayor has no control over, the police department particularly, with police brutality and the mayor's stupid responses to problems that just continue to become more and more aggravated, that's why you have people saying what they're saying. Now, true enough, until there is someone who is able to inspire those same people that are listening to that to come out, you've got the activists who you saw, and they are going to vote, and they're going to get a lot of other people to vote, but that still isn't enough to do what happened when Harold Washington was the mayor. When Harold Washington campaigned, the one thing he did do, which I'm sure this mayor remembers, is he made his own candidacy by those debates with Jane Byrne and Richard Daley. And everyone, notwithstanding whether you were a so-called left-wing activist or whatever you were, people would say, this guy's got something going, and he had ideas. Now, because of the fact that it's very difficult to get that much money, you've got candidacies that just never get off the ground. All things being equal, there are a lot of people who could defeat Daley, but the problem is he is so entrenched, there are so many people who owe him so much, they will do whatever is necessary to keep him there. And ironically, and I was telling someone this not too long ago, this is ironic in my opinion, that it's Mayor Washington, ironically, we can thank for Mayor Daley being there. And people say, well, what are you talking about? When Daley split the vote, and Harold Washington in the primary, when he won, did not get a majority. He won with a plurality. The votes that Byrne and Daley got were more than Harold received, and Daley was a poor third. So people looked at him as being the reason that we had a black mayor. the racists did. In fact, the joke then was, what do you get when an Irishman screws an Irish woman? You get a black mayor. So that was the joke at the time. Daley was through. I mean, he was spat on in a grocery store. He was attacked by someone. He was through. He was the state's attorney at the time. When he got ready to run for re-election, for whatever reason, the so-called dream ticket, as Harold Washington called it, including Richard Daley for re-election, if he had said, I want him out, that would have been through. He resuscitated his, in my opinion, he resuscitated his political life. Then, after he was re-elected and the mayor passed away, then you have a black mayor, an interim mayor. Then you have some blacks, for whatever reason, and this is very interesting. He's with Channel 2.
Channel 2?
Yeah. He's one of the reporters at Channel 2. That's funny.
Yeah, this is a big town, but it's a small town, too.
Listen, I always say there's only 500 people in the world.
Out there united against Daley. You know, but then you begin to talk to people about just how really against Daley they are, and you begin to get sort of differing views of this. So, was the black political leadership as united against Daley as, you know?
Well, some are and some aren't. Some profess to, I should start, some African American leaders, and particularly politically astute or more so elected officials who you would see participate in a Dump Daley rally, are not all as much against the mayor as they might profess to be. They are concerned about being reelected. When council wars was going on, it was unbelievable. There wasn't anybody, whether they wanted to or not, that could have come out, any African American elected official could have come out and said, I'm against Harold Washington. It would have been political suicide to do so. So you got the same thing now. You have some people who will go out and make a speech, but yet what they do is not entirely consistent as to what they speak. So that definitely happens. It's when people are found out, of course, that's a risk that they take. We have had aldermen, for instance, that were defeated because they supported Jane Byrne against Harold Washington. But now some of those people are the most active council members that you can find who are saying what the black community needs. So there is a situation of as it is in any political situation, people saying one thing and doing something else.
Is it possible for a black alderman to publicly back Daley at this point, even if they really deal with him?
What we have is some black aldermen have even come out and backed Daley publicly. Only one, to my knowledge, did in this last election prior to the election. However, a number of them after the election said that they were backing Daley. One gentleman said that he needed the mayor to do what was needed in his ward. Well, he can get done what he needs in his ward anyway, but that's an excuse that's needed. Maybe it's something he needs done for himself that he couldn't get without the mayor there. I don't know about that. But yes, there are some who've really come out. I see at this point there's something that's going to happen soon that I think is really going to bring about a new movement. In fact, I can tell you right now, you'll get a probably what you might call a scoop. I don't know when this is going to play, but Judge R. Eugene Pencham, who is a very well-respected black leader in Chicago, who is a retired judge, just said on my show, well, he didn't say it on the show this morning, and I'm speaking something that he hasn't said publicly, but he's being asked by a number of people to run for state's attorney. And that would be excellent because we have a situation in Chicago where there are no African Americans, in my opinion anyway, who really care about what kind of administration we have in the state's attorney's office, which is extremely important, that has a Republican or a Democratic endorsed candidate to vote for. We have the incumbent Republican who has done some things that have really upset the African American community. A white off-duty policeman shot a black homeless person, and he didn't even want to indict him. You've got the Democratic endorsed candidate who is one of the lawyers who was involved in the lawsuit for the remap that I mentioned earlier, where blacks are being treated in a terrible way relative to the remap of the Chicago City wards. So you've got two people there who are definitely showing their disinterest in the black community.
Okay, well, just last thing, and Louis, this may be what your thing. In terms of the Dump Daley ride one last time, there seems to be a Chicago style. It's almost like Machiavellian in terms of, you say one thing, but it's kind of the way you say it. Your shoulder might be dipped in one direction. I mean, we were over at WVUN, and there were people, like the slightest association with Daley.
Let me give you an example. It was an aldermanic roundtable, okay, and the incumbent was being challenged that he didn't attend the Dump Daley rally by his opponents, and he kept on saying, I thought it was a pro-Joe Gardner rally. I didn't think it was a Dump Daley rally. I'm not interested in going to a Dump Daley rally. And it seemed to be very subtle, but nevertheless sending out some sort of message to people.
Is that a tenet of Chicago politics?
Like Chicago. It's just.
Yeah.
Can you explain how
it
that?
It sounds like insider baseball, but obviously he figured the listeners would pick up on all that stuff.
Yeah, all right. Yeah, I think there are situations in Chicago that are probably a lot different than many other places that certainly someone who is a foreigner, meaning not a Chicagoan, would have a problem. In fact, that's one of the problems we have here with the press. These TV stations and others send in people from out of the city, and they don't have a clue as to what's really going on. So you get all kinds of erroneous reporting, some that we even laugh about because it's so far off what's really going on. Things that have happened throughout the last 15 to 20 years in Chicago politics, particularly in the African American community, can be mentioned on a show such as mine without anybody having any idea what is really being stated, unless, of course, they are a part of it. There are people who are even in Chicago who wouldn't even realize that, unless, of course, they are in the political mix. There is a separate jargon. There are code words. There are things that they are different, even though people may call themselves independents. There are different independent camps within the African American community. But the thing I think that will probably bring about a change in this, in my opinion, to the positiveness of African American empowerment are two things that have happened recently, which I see has changed things quite a bit. Number one was the O.J. Simpson trial, which I think showed a lot of people, some blacks who think, well, things are getting better relative to race relations. I think the aftermath or the impact of the verdict of the O.J. Simpson trial really showed a lot of people how much racism really lives in this city, or this country rather, and particularly Chicago. And in addition to that, I think something that has had a great impact here is the Million Man March. There are people who are heading up a group called the Metropolitan Planning Committee of the Million Man March that are, again, some of these same activists, but there are more people joining them. And I think all we need at this point is something where you have a candidate that can excite people, as Harold Washington did. And there are some people who I think can do that, who are getting ready to make some moves that I think might really change the situation in politics that we have here today.
Louis?
We live in New York. We've traveled all over. I don't think we've ever been in a city that seems as race-obsessed as Chicago. I certainly haven't been in a city where whites are as frank about their racism. They'll make upfront racist statements to strangers, which in New York you know better.
Right.
Polite company. Here it's like nobody tries to conceal it. I sometimes feel it's 25 years behind the times. But politically, though, what are whites in Chicago afraid of in terms of this coalition building, in terms of why they're with Latinos, in terms of what there was with Harold Washington, and what did they lose with Harold Washington to get back after Harold Washington died? Lucky for them. What are they afraid of politically? Okay.
Yeah. I don't think that most people would even question the fact that Chicago is probably more racist, not only in its housing patterns, but also in its political philosophy. And I'm talking about not the leadership necessarily, but the leadership, unfortunately, is a microcosm of, or I should say an extension, actually, of a representation of what their constituents is all about. White people in Chicago don't have a problem with saying that they are racist or making comments The press, again, perpetuates that. When you have a situation where someone's mistreating children or whatever, right away they'll show a black family. We have a situation out in the northern suburbs, for instance, not too long ago, where they admitted that there were feces spread all over the wall and all kinds of other things. You never saw that person. They were white. They never even showed them. Whenever anybody talks about someone on welfare, they'll put up a black face, when those who know there are more white people on welfare than there are blacks. What I'm saying here, though, in Chicago, there seems to be this obsession with not only the racism, but trying to justify it. There was a time when, for instance, the schools, and I was a part of this, we were talking about we have to integrate the schools, that schools, public education is not only the process of educating, is also socialization. People get to live together, if they get to know each other. I don't think most people care about that anymore. Whites certainly tried to stop it. There were blacks who were attempting to implement it, and I think now that black people have gotten to the point where, okay, they don't want us, we don't want to be with them either, and as a result, nobody cares. I mean, race relations in this town are at a low ebb. I understand that might be nationally, and I'm not sure about nationally, but I know in Chicago there are blacks who care less about whites and vice versa. And where the Hispanics fit in, of course, depends on where they are, whether they're black Hispanics or white Hispanics. They fall in the same situation. But I think it's unfortunate. However, it's the reality, and right now, this mayor certainly isn't doing anything. This administration isn't doing anything to in any way mitigate that sociological phenomenon.
So my following up on that then is, so what politically are whites afraid of? What would happen if the blacks got together and there was another Harold Washington?
Sure.
What are they fearing? Yeah.
Right.
What are they fearing?
Is it a threat?
Yeah. The only thing that whites could really fear by black political empowerment, or for instance another African American mayor, is money. We talk about patronage. Well, the real patronage in this city is pinstripe patronage. The lawyers, the other people who get the professional contracts. You attended a city council meeting where the council voted on a contract to give some of the mayor's allies a lot of money. That happens all the time. So that's their major concern, is money. That's power. The other things, of course, unlike Mayor Washington, many of Mayor Washington's supporters and allies were very upset over the fact that he was so democratic and he had so many whites. And a lot of folks said, well, why you got all these white people around? Why you got all these Hispanics? He believed in that. Black people have a greater propensity, seemingly, in positions of political power, to be a lot more democratic or equitable than their white counterparts. And that's not just in Chicago, that's happening in other places. But I think the major fear is that they don't want to lose what they have. They lost it once before, and that situation is something that they don't want to take a chance on again.
So you could say that last line and say they lost it once before when
Yeah.
Harold Washington was mayor.
Right, okay.
Wasn't that word for word?
Okay, all right.
What whites fear?
Yeah. I think what whites fear more than anything else is possibly losing what they did to Harold Washington, that they were able to regain by his death, and they want to make sure that doesn't happen again.
Is that okay, Lou?
Yep, that's great.
Harold Washington. Later on today we're going to be looking for the iconization, the photographs.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, for an audience that's not from Chicago, and for a non-African American audience, try to, with as much feeling as you can, tell us what Harold Washington meant to the African American community of this town.
Harold Washington meant to the African American community the closest thing to being a political godfather than anybody probably ever will be, because of his unique personal character attributes, not only being extremely bright, being extremely articulate, being warm, gregarious, outgoing. He could deal with everybody. He could make people proud when he would get on TV and just destroy the opposition relative to his ability to do so, his verbal pyrotechnics, if you will. And people felt like that was their hero, their champion. He was riding off into battle and he was always victorious. And I think that in addition to that, so many people that possess those qualities are sort of standoffish. Many of them are introverts or whatever. Harold was an extrovert. Although he was a very, very learned person, he liked to sit at home and read. He was just as comfortable going out talking to people. He was a warm human being, and he really cared. And I think that most people do not believe that most politicians care. He certainly was not someone who was in it for himself. People who knew him knew that he wasn't in it for money. And in fact, we talked earlier about what whites fear losing. One of the things that I pointed to that I thought was so funny, I mentioned it to the press at the time, that they missed it. The real thesis of council wars. Alderman Verdoliak was the leader of the opposition forces, and one day he comes in, the council meeting starts, and Alderman Verdoliak arises, and the mayor, who of course is the president of the council, states, "For what purpose does the alderman of the 10th Ward arise?" And the alderman responded, "I want to thank you." The mayor says, "Thank me for what?" He said, "Well, a horse ran an aqueduct named Harold, and I bet on him, and he won, so I want to thank you for the tip." So everybody laughs, and the mayor says, "If you were a gentleman, you would share your winnings." Everybody laughs. Verdoliak's response was, "That's what I've been trying to tell you for 3 years." So the suggestion being, of course, if you had shared in the winnings, we wouldn't be having these battles. And that's what I meant earlier about what people were fearful of losing. But this is a man who everybody knew or felt was in favor of this city going forward and together. Let me say this, too. One of the things that I accomplished while I was in the council, I was a point man for going to a group called Save Our Cities, Save Our Neighborhoods, which appeared to be a white racist group who said that the mayor was trying to run all the white people out of the city of Chicago. In meeting with their representatives, I found, well, these are reasonable people. What they're asking is nothing that they shouldn't have. And I set them together with the mayor, which was a risk, but it worked out, and they became the mayor's allies. So the mayor was concerned about reaching out to those kind of people. This mayor would never take that kind of risk. The verbiage, the comments that these people were making about Washington was just as bad as anything you heard in these dumb Daley rallies. But this Daley would never meet with those people that were making those comments. Harold Washington, however, was willing to meet with anybody. He was willing to reach out. So I think all of these things collectively were the reason why he will always be revered by anyone in the black community, and which is why you go to so many places, you'll see his picture hanging on the wall.
Is he sort of held in the same regard as you would, with different ethnic groups with their politicians on the wall, and sort of Irish people with Kennedy on the wall? And
I think you could compare Harold Washington to many politicians of other ethnic backgrounds, but rarely would you see someone who is a mayor be honored to the degree that he is. And that, of course, is the reason we haven't had any black governors, we haven't had any black presidents at this point. So to compare him with a Kennedy, yes, blacks may feel even more strongly about him than Irishmen feel about Kennedy, because they felt closer to him and they felt that he was someone there who was really there to help them. He was the kind of person, and Kennedy had this too, but he was the kind of person, of course it was much better because many people were able to meet him, but people felt that they knew him. He just had that kind of warmth, and in a public setting, he had this ability to pick people out, to mention during his talk, to identify people, that he had a great memory. He had been active in the community, of course, for so many years, so he knew many, many people. Those who did not know him, or he did not know, still felt that they did. He was just that warm of a person.
Yep. We're going to switch gears for a second.
Okay.
Talk about your experience in the wards. Last year when we were covering the aldermanic races, another thing special about Chicago, obsession with signs, getting your signs up, tearing your opponent's signs down. We went out with a crew, and they just happened to be plastering over the opponent's signs in the middle of the night.
the opponent's face was on it, so they were plastering right over their
I
face.
mean, why are signs? I mean, do people get passionate about signs in Chicago?
There is a city ordinance in Chicago that prohibits you pasting up signs, political signs or whatever, on the public way, which includes utility poles and the like. Of course, it's impossible to enforce because if you were to find the individual who is the benefactor of the sign, obviously you would just paste up your opponent's signs and he would be fined. So that won't work. What happens, though, in Chicago, seemingly this is sort of an activity that is at a higher grade here in this city than other places. There is this suggestion, and maybe it's psychological, that the person who has up the most signs has the best organization. And perhaps, that's an indication that if I have all these signs up, I've got people who are supporting me, and I'm going to beat you, whether, of course, you're paying somebody to put the signs up or not. In some instances, and I can say this from personal knowledge, sometimes the candidate doesn't even know that people are out pasting signs up all over the place. What is the best thing to do, of course, what really shows an indication of support is not a sign pasted on a billboard or over somebody else's sign on a utility pole. The sign in a window, that means that the person is supporting you. At least the probability is much greater if someone is willing to take a sign and put it within their home or their business inside the window and it's not just pasted up. It means a lot more. But the sign wars will continue here, and the losers there are the public, because you can go through the streets of Chicago and literally see signs of campaigns that are 10 years old, and it looks bad. It's probably the equivalent of graffiti, and I certainly would be one that would be in favor of at least preventing putting up signs with an adhesive. I never did that. We always put them up so they could be removed. Now, of course, that makes it very easy for the opposition. That's one thing that normally does happen, even though they try to prevent it. There have been agreements made, okay, you leave mine, I'll leave yours, but some overzealous person will go out. Either they're lying or the person they can't control their workers, and they'll go out and tear down somebody else's sign. I've even seen guns pulled on people relative to signs. I also saw this because I was part of it. We were out one night many years ago before I was an elected official, but I was supporting a candidate, and we happened to see the person putting up the opposition sign. So the gentleman with me said, well, listen, Cliff, we can cut out a lot of time, get some sleep. Let's just take the signs away from him before he puts them up. And that's what we did. So, that's what, it really, that made it a lot easier. So. The other thing that I think is odd, I'll tell you another interesting story about signs. When I was young and working with an organization, and not really thinking these things were for real, my committeeman, Democratic committeeman, wonderful man, says, Cliff, we need a couple of workers. So one of your organization members, we had a young group, said, sure, what do you want us to do? Well, I want you to go over to the Republican committeeman's office. I said, what? Well, the Republican committeeman had a bunch of signs in his office, and he needed us to go in to pack them up and take them to the garbage. So the Republican committeeman calls the Democratic committeeman, send somebody over and help me get rid of all this trash that I have, because, of course, he really wasn't a Republican. He was a Republican legislator, in fact, but he was only there at the permission of the Democratic leadership. So, again, that is one thing in Chicago that would be wonderful. Right now, and a lot of people don't realize this, the Republican Party in Chicago is third, second to, obviously, first is the Democratic Party, but the Harold Washington Party turns out more votes than the Democratic Party does.
Chicago once had something that other people didn't have, and that was the old Daley machine. And, when we come over here, we see precinct captains, we see block organizations, we see these things broken down ward by ward. You don't see that in other cities. I realize it's not the way it used to be.
Yeah.
Can you describe just what this organizational legacy is in Chicago and how that affects politics?
The organization, the political organization called the Machine in Chicago operated extremely well. It doesn't anymore, and it's very easy to explain why. The major reason it operated as well as it did was the phenomenon of the activity called patronage. All of the city jobs, county, state jobs, were controlled by the chairman of the party, and the chairman of the party was Richard J. Daley. Although he inherited the machine, he just enhanced it and refined it. But most of the people who were out ringing doorbells or working for candidates weren't there because they wanted to be. They weren't volunteers. They had jobs. And at that time, when you came back with your report as to what your vote was, if it wasn't sufficient, all your committeemen need do is to write what they called a vice letter, and you were out of work. So you had an incentive to get out there and do whatever was necessary. Some people say even steal votes. I never saw anybody steal any votes, but of course we hear that that was the case. I'm not sure that's true or not. The point is this: if you have a family, obviously, and they need to eat, you have a great motivation to keep your job. To keep your job, you had to turn in a good vote. Whether you did your job well was secondary. In other words, you had a lot of people who did not do their jobs very well, but, you know, whatever it was they were doing. But as far as being good political workers, precinct captains, whatever, they did that well, which is why they kept their jobs. There was a federal suit file called the Shackman Decree, which allegedly did away with patronage on that level. That is one reason why the machine does not exist as it did then, because you can't do what you used to do relative to hiring and firing on political reasons only. At one time that was totally legal. Now it is illegal. People have been sued as a result of that, and the complainants, the litigants, have won their cases. So you still have people, obviously, who are there because they don't, even though they don't want to be, because they are getting other things. There are other ways of rewarding people other than just giving them a job, you know. And of course, people need things. Businessmen need various things, and sometimes it's not what they give you, is what they don't give you. In other words, you don't want the inspectors? Okay, you know. So there's ways of doing that, but that primarily is what caused the real demise of the machine, as it was talked about, was the fact that most of the people, in fact, there were some committeemen who did not want to volunteer. They wanted to be able to control that person. I don't care what you think, this is what you do. Like the Marines, you know, don't think, just do what we tell you. And the only way to do that is to have the power to affect someone negatively economically. If somebody is a volunteer, they can tell you, well, hey, you know, I don't agree with you. Well, that's the last thing they wanted, was dissent. Ward organizations were not a democratic group. There were no votes on let's do it this way. It was done the way it was passed down from the county chairman.
You know something? Why don't I do this one general thing right now? Okay, for an audience that's never been here and doesn't know just how colorful and crazy and sometimes corrupt and inside baseball this politics is, in your strongest smiling voice or whatever, tell us Chicago politics is.
All right. Chicago politics is a part of the very life of Chicago. It's totally different than anywhere else. People are involved in it. It's almost like a sporting event. If you go to other cities, an election, I've been shocked. An election may be a week away and you listen to the news and you wouldn't even know it. In Chicago, there are polls every day. The news media always interviewing people, and people are involved. Again, I'm a talk show host. We continuously talk about politics. There is not a day that I have a show. In fact, my show is basically politics and law and you know, current events. But politics is the breath of Chicago. I think it's probably more important as something that everybody has something to say about. Everybody's got an idea. Everybody knows that things should be done this way. Everybody knows who is a crook. Everybody, everyone has an opinion. I don't know of any other subject matter other than politics that anyone you stop in the street can tell you something about somebody that's related to politics.
So even though we have a Shackman Decree, you know, that doesn't mean that people don't still volunteer, and that doesn't mean that we still don't have an organization that's far and above an organization you find in other towns, is it?
Right. Even though we have a Shackman Decree that prohibits the hiring and firing based on politics, there nevertheless exist other forms of patronage. One is what we call pinstripe patronage. That's where bond counsel,
We've actually done that. You've done that pretty well. I was thinking
you
more
want to go
just the
back?
level of organization. Okay, so about that. I mean, that aspect of Chicago.
Yeah, one thing that I think perpetuates the interest in Chicago politics is the fact that since it is almost a sport or the city pastime, everybody wants to get involved in some way, and many people get involved simply because they want to be around the action. We even have, I guess, what do you call the people who hang around rock stars? You've got people who want to hang around politicians. You've got young people who want to come into ward organizations and just help work. So even though patronage is dead, and it really isn't, it really, don't get me wrong, there are ways of circumventing anything, and there's certainly ways of helping people so that they have a feeling of the fact that they owe you, and they'll come in and work in a ward organization and lick envelopes and go out and ring doorbells or whatever. But there is that feeling of accomplishment. And again, just like people go out and root for a team and sit in the cold and do all kinds of things, people will go out and work for a candidate, and they feel a sense of accomplishment when in fact their candidate wins, whether they are getting something directly out of it or not. And that's fine. In fact, I don't really see anything wrong, technically or legally, well, legally now since the Shackman decree, but that same thing certainly exists, notwithstanding they say it doesn't, in every form of government, because you always have people who are exempt. We have people who are exempt from the Shackman decree, but in the federal and state legislatures and governments, you certainly have people who work only because of the fact that they are being paid to go out and be politicians and do whatever. So I don't see anything wrong with it. But in Chicago, it's just at a higher level because it gets so emotional. I think when you can see, for instance, a mayor or a candidate, rather, for mayor going into a Catholic church and practically causing a riot because he happened to be African American, and the Catholic Church, St. Pascal's, was up on the northwest side. I mean, that is wild. I mean, that, even though maybe they don't want to vote for him, they didn't even want him in the church, and they acted accordingly. That's the kind of emotionalism I'm talking about, which you don't see in other places. Now, obviously, there's some good and some bad. What I just mentioned is bad. But what I hope to happen in the black community is that we get to the point where we were in 1983, when the height of emotion was just unbelievable, when you could walk downtown, and this is why I knew he was going to win, and see every black person you saw with a Harold Washington button, that blue button with the white sun rays coming out of it. You knew then the height of emotion was to the point where there was no way he could lose. That same emotion is shared by many people, but not to the degree that it was at that time in the African American community, and hopefully we will regain that.
Is there apathy politically in the African American community right now?
I think in the African American community we have a greater degree of apathy than we've had in some time, because it's still a letdown when you have something and give it away, which is exactly what happened. There was no reason in the world for the black community to lose the having the chief executive of this city. We had a person who was the interim mayor. There were other black politicians who went into the courts to demand a special election. And then there was this division within the black community, which never should have happened. It didn't have to happen. In fact, some people think that it was a conspiracy. In other words, when you talk about, well, I won't even get into that, but there are some folks who think that what happened was people were paid to do certain things. I'm not sure that's true. There's certainly some indication to that. But I think you still hear some very vitriolic comments from one group to another based on what happened then. Finally, I think there is some healing. I think, again, the Million Man March has helped to bring that about. We have groups forming. Minister Farrakhan stated at the mall in D.C. that everybody should get politically involved and not with any specific party. I agree with that. I think the best thing that can happen is to have a multi-party system here, well, nationally for that matter, but I see more people becoming more involved with issues. They're becoming issues-oriented, and possibly this can be translated into gaining some political interest that would do away with some of the apathy we see now. The apathy just isn't in the black community. We have now in the city of Chicago, with an election in a few days, presidential primary, we have next to the lowest number of registered voters than we have ever had in the history of the city for a presidential primary. Now, how many of those people are even going to come out? But even from the very beginning, you obviously have an indication that it's going to be a low turnout because you have low registration, you have a low pool.
Okay, last question.
Wait, that
Sure.
was really good, but I felt you sort of veered off a little bit from the original.
Maybe I did.
You basically started, said, when you have something like the first black mayor of the city, and you give it away.
Yeah.
And then you went into an explanation.
Well, that's because I'm not gonna sit here and identify people that I think sold us out.
We don't want you to do that. But what we want you to do is sort of complete the thought. You sort of write very quickly.
What that means, what that feels like.
Therefore, you feel despondent, apathetic, whatever. I mean, it's a psychological fact.
Yeah.
So just get it basically in a nice short statement. That
Okay.
would really help us out.
All right.
It's a really good thing.
Just
Okay.
when you lose,
Yeah. Okay.
whenever you're ready.
Relative to apathy, I think apathy is probably a normal psychological result of having had something and lost it, particularly when you know that the loss could have been prevented. And I think that we're still suffering from that. I think that is one of the primary reasons for the apathy that does exist in the African American community politically. And I think to get out of that, there has to be some sort of event, either a candidate or a circumstance that can sort of shake people out. There's always been the case where many people have said, why vote? We'll stay home. They came out to vote for Harold Washington because they thought there was a reason to. So they will come out if they feel there's a reason. So there has to be something that motivates them to feel there's a reason to come out. Harold did it. I think we can do it again.
This whole series is about how culture, society, people are reflected in politics. There's some people that say you got to go to Washington, D.C. and cover the president and cover the senators to understand American politics. And this whole series is dedicated to saying that's not the case. You got to go to places like Chicago. Okay, if you agree with that, can you give us that in a strong statement as to understand American politics? You got to go to the local. Go for it.
I think that to really understand American politics, someone who certainly epitomized that understanding was Tip O'Neill, Speaker of the House, who simply said all politics is local. All politics is local. If you don't understand what the basics are in various precincts, ward organizations, then you have no understanding of the American political system. There are so many people within the Beltway in Washington that I know and have talked to who don't have a clue as to even how people get there. I think it's very important. Precinct captains or community representatives, as they're called here now, since we don't have patronage anymore, are sort of the same thing as an infantry squad leader. An infantry squad leader has the most difficult job. He is responsible for more people than anybody, because as you go up the ladder, the way organizations always stand, there are fewer people that you are directly responsible for. The platoon leader is only responsible to 4 squad leaders, not 9 other men. And as you go up the ladder, you are responsible. Your responsibilities may be greater, but there are fewer people that you really have a responsibility to oversee. The precinct captain is the person out there talking to those individuals. The committeeman oversees the precinct captain, but the committeeman doesn't have to go into those homes and explain certain things that the captain has to do. The captain also has to explain not only what his committeeman is doing, but also why you should vote for the President of the United States. So, in other words, the whole situation revolves around what happens locally. People will never even get to Washington unless they understand that. That's why political analysts, or not analysts, but consultants are becoming a profession, because they understand that. And every candidate knows that they have to have somebody who's going to be out there to get the message across to the grassroots constituency. There are some changes, true enough. One of the major changes, of course, is the press. The precinct captain does not get into the house as often as the TV does. So, of course, you have to be able to offset that, and also to use the television to your advantage, if in fact you can. this is why, again, we get into a situation, unfortunately, where money makes a difference, because the more money you have, the more TV time you can buy. But again, I cannot reiterate strongly enough that the place to find out what really goes on in American politics is in the precinct, not in somebody's office in Washington, D.C.
Great.
That's great.